Hello, everyone. Welcome to our PhD to Tech UX panel. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tori Wauber. I'll be hosting the panel today. Our goal for today's panel is to have folks who have made the leap from PhD to Tech UX share their expertise and experience with all of you. And my hope is that we each come away from today with a sense of greater opportunity of what's possible with doctoral level training in roles outside of academia. So to get us kicked off, just so that we can get to know the attendees a little bit, can I have folks drop into chat what stage of your PhD you're at, or if you're post-PhD, feel free to drop that in. So just drop that into chat so the panelists and I can get a sense of who's in attendance. Let's see here. Post-PhD, final year, finishing up. All right, we've got some third and fourth. All right. Broad spread of folks. Postdoc, incoming PhD. Wow, okay, we've got a good representation here across different PhD stages. Awesome. Okay, so here's our structure for today. We're going to kick off with a few questions that I have for panelists. We'll have a few places for folks to engage via chat, and then I'll gather questions from the chat later on during our panel. For attendees, I'll ask that you hold gratitude for our panelists sharing their time, and you'll get the most from today if you are present. And again, I'm going to have a moment later where I ask for questions via the chat. All right, I'm going to start off by introducing the panel. I'll introduce myself, and then I'll introduce our other panelists, and we'll dive right in. So for those who don't know me, I'm Tori Wauber. I'm a career and leadership coach. I got my PhD in human evolutionary biology from Harvard in 2012. I then spent 7 years in the tech industry at Facebook and Google, where I was a data scientist, a people analyst, and a growth marketer. I enjoy helping PhDs make the leap into industry because I made this jump myself, and I've now landed more than 50 PhDs in industry roles. I think there's real opportunity there. So excited to get to chat with our panelists today. Let me introduce them. Christina Huang is a quantitative UX researcher or user experience researcher at Google. She received her PhD in policy analysis from Pardee Rand Graduate School. Prior to working at Google, Christina took part in the Insight Data Science program, which I think was around the time we connected. And prior to Google, worked at Facebook in people analytics. Welcome, Christina. Yeah, hi. Okay, Donald Cahill is also a quantitative UX researcher at Google. He received his PhD in experimental psychology at Harvard, where we met postdocing when I was postdocing in a large cement 1960s era building, I believe. Prior to working at Google, Donald was a postdoc at MIT and a research associate at UCL. Welcome, Donald.
Hello, everybody.
And Jared Larson is a senior manager of user experience at Google, where we met working together to grow Google Cloud. He received his PhD in human-centered design at the University of Washington. His PhD work was focused on point-of-purchase environmental labels for consumer products. Prior to Google, Jared managed UX teams at Qualtrics, Alaska Airlines, and Amazon, building on experience early in his career at Boeing. Welcome, Jared.
Thank you. Nice to see you all.
Hi, excited to get started. All right, so let's start off with a question that I imagine will be of interest to many folks in attendance, which is how you first made the leap from your PhD into the tech industry. Donald, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Yeah, it's quite a story, I guess, and fun to look back on. I think practically once the decision was made to try find a job outside of academia, everything became a lot easier. So I think that the getting to that point was maybe the hardest part of the journey. And I'm guessing most people are at least close to that point. And so maybe the good news is that it's a lot easier once you reach that point. Practically, I think I had, fortunately enough, a lot of good examples who've gone ahead of me, more trailblazing folks like Tori. And so I had a good group of people to reach out to, and I think the initial thing was just reaching out to people and learning an awful lot about what was out there. I think sort of hold up for me was not being quite sure what was out there that matched what I enjoyed doing as an academic. and it never felt like, I think the prevailing wisdom, at least from sort of career services and just generally around, was that you should, data science was the thing to do if you had any sort of like tech ability at all, was to become a data scientist. But a lot of what I heard about being a data scientist didn't appeal. Just like I went to a lot of like panels and things with people who were data scientists and told me what they did. They all seemed very happy, but it didn't quite grab me. And then I think, just from talking to friends, heard about user experience research, and then heard specifically about type of user experience research, which was also a bit more quantitative sided. And for me, who was an experimental psychologist who had moved into and sort of had a bit of an aptitude for doing things like computational modeling of decision making, stuff like that, and had like a bit of technical ability, not a whip smart statistics expert sort of thing, but like could do it and was comfortable doing it, and felt it was a good way to approach the questions I like to research. Hearing about that role was another sort of step, because it sounded like, okay, this is a good match for what I do day to day. And then it was just a matter of talking to people and putting applications in, and sort of, I think it was a hairy process, because I think there's always a time pressure academic wise. There's the next postdocs are time limited. Graduation is upcoming. It's all kind of scary, and a lot of industry applications take a while, even though it's generally faster than academic stuff. Still can take a while to get through the whole pipeline. So I applied to places that had roles along these lines. It was Google, Facebook, I think, Spotify was another one. They're the ones that I remember. I think through some applications, some other things come around. I remember talking to someone at Netflix, but that was a terrible mismatch of a conversation. So there's definitely a lot of like dead ends, but ultimately the role of Google panned out, and that was, and haven't really looked back since. So I think that take home are just talking to lots of people, exploring every avenue. The other couple of practical things I think I got that were good advice were just like, make a good LinkedIn profile, very simple things, make a good resume, and be able to send it around. And so I probably spent far too long trying to get a good profile photograph for LinkedIn. In retrospect, that was a wasted amount of time, but still, I think that was a good thing.
Nice. Talk to people, LinkedIn, a little bit, resume. And Dona, one request from folks in the chat. You're coming in a little bit quiet for folks. And so potentially just leaning closer to your mic or projecting more would be awesome. Jared, Christina, anything you want to say about that initial leap?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add. First of all, thanks, Tori, for hosting this session. I kind of wish something like this happened when I was in undergrad or graduate school, to understand a little bit more about careers that I was not really very well exposed to. So kudos to you for organizing. But anyway, I am in a sort of unique role in the sense that, or position in the sense that, I was doing my graduate school at the same time I was working. So I had a full-time job as a master's student, and I was working in a company, and then I ended up going to pursuing my PhD while I was working. So in my case, I was sort of exposed to the corporate world as I started graduate school, and I sort of kept engaging. I will also say that whereas all of us on the call today, at least the panelists, are all user experience people, and actually user experience as a discipline really did come out of academia. So we had human factors, and the founders of user experience work, like Jacob Nielsen, had PhDs. It is not the only discipline inside large companies like tech companies that have PhDs as a standard, a pretty standard thing. So I'm happy to unpack that a little bit more. But I didn't make the leap so much as I was sort of living in two worlds, and then yeah, in that direction.
Let's actually unpack that user experience role a little bit more. So you mentioned that it came out of maybe academics. How does the user experience day-to-day differ from other roles in tech, differ from what you might be doing as a postdoc or a professor?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start, but I certainly want Donald and Christina to augment this. So when we say user experience, typically we are talking about at least one of two roles. There's a user experience design role where those people are designing interfaces or human affordances of some type, physical devices or electronic device, digital devices. But then the predominance of PhDs end up in some sort of research role. So user experience researchers fall into two general classes: quantitative research, we are looking at data signals and you're running surveys and so forth. And then there's a qualitative UX research role, which is more common in places like Google, where you're doing anthropological work, you're doing interviewing, you're doing all the qualitative goodness that you might do in the academic world. You're doing it quickly, sometimes lightweight, but you're doing that. So when we say UX, typically we're referring to research. It's far less common for a PhD to be a designer, although that happens to be my experience and my background. So, but research is the predominant role.
And I'll maybe add to that that as Donald mentioned, quantitative UXR is very similar to data science, and I actually came from initially a data science path into industry, and then switched over to quant UXR, and they're very similar in kind of the methods that you might be using. You might be doing a lot of logs research, or working with data, working with survey data. But I think the difference is really thinking about the behavioral aspect of that's beneath the data and beneath the numbers. As a data scientist, you might be reporting on metrics, and they may be related to people, number of users, or number of user behaviors. And quant UXR really digs into a little bit more. How did that data come to be? What are the mechanisms underneath that? Why are we expecting this? And maybe more importantly, how might we move this using what we know about people and how people behave? What are the expectations around introducing new stimuli or new products? So really digging into when you do an A/B test, why would you expect something to change? What is that human behavior that would be driving that?
Yeah, I think plus one to all of that, especially that contrast between quant UXR and data science. I think like an interesting thing that I'd add to it all is that I think the difference between, say, being a professor and a postdoc is actually far starker day to day than the difference between being a postdoc and a researcher in the industry. I think day to day, there's a surprisingly large amount that's very similar to what I did day to day as a postdoc, which I was writing R scripts, analyze data, I was setting up experiments on internet platforms, and I was trying to make sense of how people were behaving and amending and hypothesizing and designing experiments again. That's what I do day to day as a researcher. The two big differences I feel are the audience you're doing research for and how you communicate it to them, and that took a while to sort of learn and get a handle on. And also the questions you're working on are inevitably different than questions as an academic. But the day-to-day process, quite similar. So.
Yeah, and so I hear that day-to-day is fairly similar to the postdoc, potentially different from a faculty position. What were the main differences, though? It's interesting. You mentioned a little bit about the timeline, right? And I know that's one that can be jarring for PhDs. What were the main sort of headwinds that you've experienced that differ a lot from what you saw in academic work?
I can maybe add a couple of pointers, but let me say, in panels we have to speak with very broad brush strokes, right? So just take what we say with a grain of salt. There are a lot of varieties with how people approach work and so forth. So I think one of the things that can feel different is the extent to which you're exploring theory. That can feel very different. The extent to which you're grounding your work in the work of others, that can feel very different. Also, sometimes you're making pretty immediate trade-offs between the budgets, access to people, and so forth that you might not feel comfortable with if you're doing a PhD where you have 3 years to pull everything together. Maybe you have 3 weeks to pull something together. So you're making trade-offs in that regard.
So a lot more trade-offs and timelines to juggle, sounds like. Anything else folks want to call out about those shocks jumping into industry or anything that differs?
Yeah, I think like sort of related to that, and maybe that's the chief one, is also your, like, the people questioning your research or making decisions on your research. I feel they're very different than the people who will question and make decisions on your research in academia. And so I think that the biggest headwind I found was, at least the biggest industry headwind was understanding the concerns and the needs and all that of the people who you're presenting the research to, or doing the research in partner with, or doing the research for. And I think there's little beyond just having the experience of working with industry people that can help you with that. So I think it's kind of good to get as much experience as you can doing that going in, both so you can, like, for your own like, so you know whether it's for you or not, and also just so that you hit the ground running when you move in. Other than that, I think, like, headwind wise, I think the headwinds I had as an academic were the same ones that I had as an industry person. I think I, like, maybe have a tendency to rabbit hole on problems, which was encouraged by academics. You really need to think about this and get it right and get it perfect. And I actually don't think that's as true as they say it is in academia. And certainly that's been the headwind as an industry person, because you faster and lighter is kind of the more prevailing way of operating. So I think, if anything, I would have been a better academic with my industry experience, for sure.
My gosh, +1 to all of that, and also very impressed with Jared's ability to multitask and answer questions in the chat. There are some really good questions that I hope we can get to. And on what Donal is saying about kind of who you're communicating with, I found that something that was really surprising to me going into industry is just kind of how flat it is. Academia is very kind of hierarchical and rigid. You have to call out specific researchers in your lit reviews, and industry, in my experience, has been very non-deferential, and there is not the same kind of sense of authority or structure the way that you get in academia. And oftentimes it's really strange, that now you're the expert on something, and you are kind of the you're the person kind of making that strong recommendation for how something is done, or what the recommendation is, what to do next.
Yeah, well, and I'll just solicit in the chat, if anyone in attendance has ever experienced academia being hierarchical, maybe just put a +1. I know I certainly have. I'm sure the panelists have felt that. And so it's interesting then, this is speaking to an aspect of industry that I think is pretty different, the level of teamwork, the stakeholder management, the relationships, the amount that differs. Anything folks want to say there about how they've learned to approach that, how that might have been challenging, how they enjoy that relative to academics?
One thing I will add, hopefully you can hear me okay. There's actually, so multitasking is crazy at this house. I've actually got people doing some construction in the room, so it's very discombobulating. But one of the really cool things about working in tech, and one of the reasons why I've known many people who have made the jump from PhD or from grad school or college to working in tech, and I don't think I know anybody who's made the leap back. I think one of the really amazing things is that you can be working with a team of like 3 or 4 people and do some really great research, unblock a team, and get your ideas developed into a product that's seen by hundreds of millions or a billion people in the next week. And that sort of ability to impact people with your research is, really extreme, right? I mean, it's kind of hard to influence at that level with, let me take a step back. It can be possible, certainly, to impact people with your research in academia, but I am constantly impressed by how relatively new people from a PhD program can actually be dropped into a program and start developing really amazing products that are seen by tons of people and ask really fundamental questions about how human beings interact with the built environment or digital experiences. So I think that is, losing track of your question a little bit, Tori, I apologize, but I think that is one of the really amazing things about applying your experience to product design, design of things. It becomes really applied very quickly, and you see your work sometimes very quickly out in the public.
Well, and I hear that opportunity for impact and that opportunity to jump in and influence very quickly. And I think many, PhDs may not realize, when you're working on this stuff in tech, you get to see the impact. You get to point to a feature in a product and say, I worked on that. That's different from the feeling of pointing to a journal article that is behind a paywall that not many folks will ever read. I mean, who's not proud that their thesis is sitting on a shelf somewhere, but that's pride, but it's a different sense of impact. One thing I see coming up in the chat, and I have this noted as a question because it comes up fairly frequently, paths into tech and experiences there. So folks ask about contracting, internship, maybe some volunteer opportunities. Anything that folks have seen on the panel that helps folks prepare to make that move into tech if one has been working in a more academic setting?
So maybe I'll start since I did a kind of transitional program. It was called Insight Data Science. And it was a 8-week fellowship for people for PhDs transitioning into industry. And it was really helpful for a few different reasons. One, it was just really nice to be around people with similar goals. So you could learn from each other, learn about Netflix culture, and maybe it wasn't for you, and practice interviews together. So having that community was really nice. And it also really helped me kind of see the breadth of roles available and how to market my skills. And I think most importantly, it introduced me to companies who were hiring and people who had successfully made the transition. So, just building that network was probably the biggest advantage of doing something like that. It is an opportunity cost of your time to do these kind of transitional programs. So I, recommend skipping it if you can, but sometimes it can be hard to, get your foot in the door. So basically anything that can help you get your foot in the door, internships, networking, that is really helpful because oftentimes, especially the big companies are looking for people who have applied experience, whether that's in an internship or in a contract position, or they want they want a little bit more reassurance that somebody can thrive in this kind of environment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think unfortunately, the best preparation for getting a job in industry is having a job in industry. Like that plus a PhD is huge. And so getting that first step in the door, I think is the big challenge. And so I think anything that gives you like something that can be pointed to that says, not only do I have everything that a PhD provide, but I also am used to talking to designers and software engineers and so forth. And so, that I think is what you need to get. And so that can be contract, internship, although I think they're kind of almost as hard to get as the job itself. But if you get an internship, that's going to be huge. Contract positions, the sort of workshop sort of transition workshops that Christine was talking about. All those things are great. And I think I also think the sort of corollary of that is that you shouldn't over-index on getting the perfect first job. It's almost better to just get a job. And I think academic stuff sort of trains you to think like, your jobs are hard and long to take, whereas if you would like to find, but if you get in one place, it like you can start looking around very soon for another thing if it doesn't suit you. And having that first job will help you find the better second job if that makes sense.
I think I can safely say for the panel that none of you is in the exact first role that you were in. Donal, your role has moved around a little bit. Christina and Jared, I know you've both moved, right? There's room to pivot once you're in that first role.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think getting, with any hiring process, regardless of whether you're a PhD or, delivering mail, like you need to be able to demonstrate that you can do the job, right? So I think, and just to really underscore the point in the thread, it is extremely common for people to start with a contract role just to demonstrate their fitment with the discipline, also to evaluate whether it's a good fit for them personally, if they like the pace. Somebody asked the question about the pace. It's a very different pace working in a tech company, and you have to be okay with fluidity, and you have to be okay with multiple studies happening at the same time. You have to be okay with making trade-offs regarding sometimes rigor, sometimes it could be any number of things, right? And some people, love it. Some people like it less, but it's very common. And I should also mention, just because a number of us happen to be from one company, it's also very common to start at a smaller firm. So maybe not contract work, but starting with a foot in the door with a startup and just building up what we call a portfolio of work. And it might be a literal portfolio of projects, but it's all just experience that you can point to and say, I have applied qualitative or quantitative research methods to a business problem, and I was able to move the business forward, or non-governmental agency, or whatever the case would be. I was able to add value to some sort of organization of some type, and here's the demonstrated work that I did. That is table stakes for any role at a company like Meta or Google, or where the case may be. And somebody asked the question, by the way, about starter job. And I think that's a good ingress. Many of us in the UX side, there's some basic methodologies that are very, very common for people to start with, right? Things like usability testing, where you walk several people through an experience and you get feedback on what works well for them, what doesn't. I would look into, I think it's a Practical Guide to Usability Testing by Jacob Nielsen. That is kind of like a basic primer for how to think about things like usability testing. Survey design is also quite common as a place to start. And then, to be honest with you, sometimes just moderation of studies, other people's studies, can be a place to start for some people. So these are all, very common, kind of getting to know the product area. And I think my first work was actually doing usability testing, and then I ended up doing much more qualitative methods and so forth. So it's quite common.
And Jared was talking about building up a portfolio of projects, and I think we haven't really touched on the interview process itself, but oftentimes you will have to do a presentation of research, hopefully product research or product, relevant research. And so having that portfolio is really helpful so that you can kind of draw on those experiences, talk through, what you did, the decisions that you made, and the implications of the research.
Yeah, again, just echo everything that's been said already. I definitely think I see a lot of people come. I guess I see two things which are sort of like I'd probably warn against. One is when presenting the research, like I think as an academic, you're typically trained to present upon the content and the sort of things you've learned about the question itself. Whereas I think much more important when presenting to people in industry is the process side of it, like the decisions you made about how to tackle the question, who was interested, how you pitched it to them, how you communicated it out, how you overcame obstacles and things like that. And I've seen far too many presentations where people rush past that and then say something that's quite inside baseball to academics and sort of lean on the very specific conclusion they found. And you're presenting this to designers and they genuinely they just don't care. So I think process over content. And the other thing is that oftentimes, and I think it might be in the chat a little bit, is like, how much should I learn specific skills to land a job? And I think like there are like things that are good minimal things to have if you don't want to be in a tech role, good to be able to code in X, Y, and Z. But generally, I think a PhD, you've got all the skills. It's kind of just that, like you're a great candidate to do. There's a job there, you're going to be great at it. It's just a matter of like having that experience of nestling into the job. And so I'd always focus your efforts less on like learning more things and more just like learning how to talk and work with people in industry and getting that experience.
Well, and let's dive in on that point, because I think getting experience as early as you can in industry through contract, volunteer, internship is helpful. But there are some ways in which your doctoral training then plays into your role, I'm sure. And so maybe if folks on the panel can speak to ways you're leveraging your doctoral training and maybe any jargon shift you had to do in that same skill moving to tech. Can folks speak to that?
Christina, please.
Oh, no, go for it, Jared.
Well, so yeah, there are many intersections between the training and what we do in tech. One thing that we do in tech for nearly anything that you experience as a consumer is experimental testing of our product design. So we do statistical testing with basically everything that we release to the public. And Tori's expert in this, actually. She was expert doing this at a former company that she used to work at. And it's really just part and parcel with how we think about product design. So it's actually very common for executives to ask about significance of this particular experience versus that. It's just everything that's released to the public is A/B tested essentially, or ABC tested. Also, just the need to figure out what's the right level of rigor for a particular research question. To Donald's point, being able to articulate a research question and get a team who's like all over the road to like take a step back and say, like, what's the most fundamental question that we have as a team to answer? Unpacking that, getting people to align on that question can sometimes be the most essential thing that a UX person can do. Yes, exactly. A/B testing is really the controlled experiments, and it could be multivariate testing, or it could be anything else. But in the case of like Facebook, your newsfeed might be different than your friend's newsfeed, and because Facebook is testing two different newsfeeds to see which one has moves a variable that they're interested in more than the other. So A/B testing is just very, very common as an example. Also, I think people appreciate a PhD's ability to look at a problem thoughtfully and really just evaluate all the different variables that could be at play and help the team understand how to move forward. Now that comes with a downside. Let me just speak to a downside. Tori didn't ask about it. I think sometimes there can be reservation for people that don't know a lot about PhDs, about whether they're inviting a very pedantic discussion every single time. So I think as a PhD, you have to be careful to kind of maintain a sense that like you're in it to build something with the team, as opposed to being the expert in the room. That's not really your role inside a corporation. Sometimes I've worked for companies where even putting PhD in your job title was kind of frowned upon, because people would sort of conjure up their perception of what that means, and they would think, oh, this is somebody who doesn't move quickly, or somebody who's going to be pedantic, or somebody who's not going to help us really unpack things and move things forward. They would just be focused on precision, as it were, but not really moving stuff forward. So it does come with a little bit of a downside, but for the most part, folks that I know are just amazing to really unpack the core questions the team has.
I like listening to Jared speak, just like brought up so many thoughts and around like this this transition into industry that I forgot what the original question was. So maybe I'll just like riff for a little bit because I think that as coming from academia, I think like you're really focused on your technical skills and like whether you have the technical qualifications for a job. Having gone through, a graduate program, and the training, rest assured, you have the technical skills and or the ability to learn what you need to on the job while somebody's paying you for it. So I think like, a gap that that I see sometimes is not focusing on the soft skills, which has been commented on, a few different ways, but just like the communication, the teamwork, I think coming from academia, sometimes you may have a little bit of scarring from, people being very adversarial, which is not the environment typically in industry. It's much more collaborative. And so you need to kind of like shift your mindset and like, realize you're in a different environment and really kind of like hone in on those soft skills, which I think is like really related to, an informal skill that's really honed in your PhD, which is resilience. You have been torn down by reviewer number 2 like so many times, and you keep going, you keep trudging through research and papers and low pay because you have a goal, because you are interested and intellectually curious, and that will serve you really well in industry. Just that you can kind of learn from mistakes, move forward, that you have this like intrinsic motivation to really like, have impact, to, do something meaningful with your skills.
Yes, that's all. I'm kind of constantly surprised by how much I exactly agree with Christina and Jared. But a couple of things I think they said I'd almost pull out again and just re-emphasize. So I think it's that part Jared said about helping teams who are sort of a little bit all over the place and mightn't quite understand what they want to know, sort of getting them to the question behind the question they come to you with is probably one of the main key skills I think that I've found it helps me be very effective. And sometimes to the point where you feel like if you just help them get the exact question right, you almost don't need to do the research. It almost sometimes answers what they want to know. And so that sort of ability, which I think is a key part of the PhD training, is just like distilling things down into a tractable question, is a huge part of the process as a industry researcher. I also think it also speaks to what Christina was saying, in that it is far more of a collaborative effort. And I think, harking back to an earlier question, Tori, like of what the sort of joys of being in industry is, I think that's one of the key ones, is that I much prefer collaborating with people. I much prefer being on the same side and all working together towards something, than the sort of oftentimes overly adversarial relationships or environment you're in academia. And so people are wonderful in industry by and large, and working with them, it's a more social process, whereas academia can often be quite isolating. I think that's been one of the sort of chief rewards of the transition.
Yeah, well, one thing I'm curious about, we're talking a little bit about the social skills, soft skills, and folks in attendance, if you can chime in the chat. I'm not even sure if soft skills are talked about in academics or whether that's a tech jargon. I don't remember, it's been a while, but I think soft skills are not even mentioned. Folks chime in and help remind me there. But these social skills, that sort of, resilience, maybe some curiosity and collaboration over arrogance. Any examples that folks want to spell out where maybe the PhD mindset or approach didn't work, or where there was a big soft skill learning that you had to go through in your time in tech, that maybe would be an illustrative example? Nope, you all did it seamlessly and no challenges. Awesome.
Maybe I'll just give a quick example where, like, I don't know about folks in the, in the chat, but, it took me 6 years to answer one question in my PhD. And, in industry, you have to answer a question, maybe a week, maybe a couple of days. And so I think that, getting used to that pace, and also, to Donald's point about like kind of asking the right question, I have had far more impact by, just presenting a simple descriptive chart versus, here's this like, Monte Carlo simulation, like 5 levels of, 5 levels of analyses. And, so I think that just getting used to the idea that sometimes less is more, or just like really that just because you have a hammer doesn't mean, everything's a nail.
Yeah, and to that point, one of the really fast, I saw this really great graphic when I was in grad school that said, basically, it said your job as a PhD, and by the time you get to your dissertation defense, you are the world's expert in one very, very, very narrow part of the universe. Like your job is to be the expert and defend that expertise amongst other people, right? Whereas one of the things I had to get used to in tech is that my job is to be agile, to understand where the newest problem is, to figure out what is the least most effective contribution I can make to unblock a team and then move to the next thing. So this resilience, this notion of resilience that Christina mentioned, is not just about hardships, but it's also about being flexible, because you're not paid to be the expert in one very narrow place. I mean, there are places inside tech companies where, there's, maybe an expert in AI, and your job is to be the, world-renowned expert in AI. In UX, it's much more fluid than that. You're really meant to be somebody who's going to, work on many different research methods, have, again, many different studies happening at one time, and then, move things forward as quickly as possible without overextending the company's resources, as it were. So that kind of resilience and flexibility is heavily favored, and nobody is expecting that you are the expert just because you have a PhD. That sort of notion that you've studied something for 6 years and therefore everybody should come to you just doesn't work in tech, at least in the UX disciplines that I'm familiar with.
Well, and maybe just a popcorn there for the panel quickly. We've talked about different levels of expertise, from 6 years of expertise to maybe 2 days. If you were to think quickly about the median time to expertise you're given, right? Median, just like most common, right in the middle. Just quick around the panel, like what's the typical amount of time you get to deliver expertise on a topic?
I guess I'd say maybe it's a bimodal thing. Some things, like, people come to you with, and you kind of are straight away an expert on it, and mostly just by virtue of you've seen the patterns and things before. You sort of understand, like, you can recognize at some level that this is a sort of question that you confronted before in some other context, and that might be an academic or another industry context. So sometimes you need a quick, like, immediate ability to be able to sort of help out. On the other end, I think, like, some of the more effective things I've done have been in cases where I've managed to be embedded a while in a team and have sort of got a point, like, where I've got to understand the dynamics of whatever the product we're working on or whatever the issue we're working on is. And, but maybe we're talking like 6 months or something. I don't know. So that might be the distribution I'd go for.
And it may be that your expertise is not that people go to you for every answer, but rather your expertise is to be able to frame a hypothesis that the team should be working on. So you're immersed in a bunch of research and you've been doing studies for some sort of product or something like that. And you can say to the team, I have this hypothesis that if you build this intervention, this thing will happen in terms of our business or in terms of what the end user or end person is experiencing. And I guess that's expertise in some way, but to the earlier point, like maybe your job is just to help pose really interesting questions the team should understand and sort of work toward. If you give me a hypothesis as a designer, I can then design an intervention, right? Now you've unblocked me. Now I can work with engineering to build something, and then we push something out in terms of an experimental design into the marketplace, and we can then measure success of that experiment and then see if that was successful. And I guess that's expertise in a sense, but the expertise is about understanding how to apply research methods to a problem. It's not expertise in a particular part of the world. It's understanding the milieu and then saying, here's the question we should investigate. Here's the right intervention. Let's move forward.
And this is a slightly kind of different angle on the question. But I think one thing to think about as you are interviewing with companies and asking questions and thinking about, these offers is to ask about the onboarding process and the expectations. Do they need somebody who's going to be able to hit the ground running, that first week? And, if they do, is that what you want? So in the larger tech companies, definitely there is time, given to buffer that you need, even just 6 months to get used to how things work and, the culture and everything, which is not to say you don't produce any wins during that time, but that it does take time to figure out the domain. Oftentimes we're bringing in, the methodologies and the kind of how from our academic programs, but you may need to ramp up in kind of the domain or the content expertise, and you will, do a much better job once you kind of understand that domain, and that will take some time.
Yeah, and there's so many layers to expertise and that I'm hearing there, right? There is the research methods expertise, the expertise on maybe your product, the organizational expertise in understanding how your organization works, which at Google took me 2 to 3 years, let's be honest, right? It's very challenging to navigate as an organization. So these different layers of expertise come into play in different ways, but that, how do you work across those sounds really important. One other thing I'm just seeing in the chat that I want to make sure we speak to, anything about the difference between quant and qual UX that's worth calling out for folks thinking about this? Anything that folks want to speak to about the differences in skills or tasks there?
I'll say one thing from my vantage point is qualitative researchers spend a considerable amount of time working individually with people or maybe with groups of people. In quantitative research circles, there can be a variation. There can be sometimes quantitative researchers who are doing things like survey design and maybe vetting their survey before they field it. There are some quantitative researchers in corporations who are looking at data signals, and their work looks very close to data science, right? And they might not be interacting with people on a direct basis. They might be using signal as a virtue. So I think in at least big companies, when there is that division, it can be pretty distinct for sure. Let me also say though that you're talking to a number of people who, at a very large corporation where those roles are quite distinct, but most companies, I would submit, have UX research roles that do a blend of quant and qual together. And, qual is more common, I would submit. But quant researchers are really, really unique, and I would submit are probably typically at the major corporations, major tech companies in particular. Is that your experience, Christina? I think you came off mute.
Yeah, I was just going to say that same thing, that, you're only going to find this specialization at larger companies, and at the smaller firms, likely you'll want to kind of talk to the company to understand what it is that they're looking for and how that aligns with what you want to do. Because again, there is so much work that can be done in UXR, and sometimes, sometimes companies are looking for something very, very niche, and then sometimes, they don't even know where to start. And so you could have you could have a hand in guiding what UX research looks like for that company or for that product.
Great call outs around how these roles differ at different sizes of company. And so it's really an encouragement for folks looking to roles to understand, okay, if I'm applying at this type of company, what does UXR mean and what goes into that? So I have a wrap-up question for folks, and I want to hear each of the panelists' view on this. And I'm going to actually borrow from a frame that Jared would frequently use with me while we were collaborating, which is a how might we? And the how might we here is, how might we empower more folks with doctoral level training to succeed in paths outside of academia? Any thoughts there? It's a meaty one, but curious for any ideas.
I guess when is the we a company or academic institutions or the candidates themselves? Because I guess I think it's probably still at a transition point where the onus for getting into industry and transitioning out is put on the candidates to a degree that I think is very stressful for our candidates and unnecessary, really. I think companies in tech, it behooves them. I think it's a huge benefit to hire more PhDs. And I think even within like roles I'm involved in, there's efforts to try make that path easier and certainly more equitable and more distributed rather than being sort of network based, which it often can be at the moment. So I think companies can do a lot that would benefit them to make the thing better. I also think academic institutions, there should be a lot more done to better broadly prepare candidates and find sort of ways to give people an exposure to other types of roles and not, I don't know how much a stigma might be around it, but when I was a PhD student, there was a huge stigma about even thinking about not being an academic. And so I think there's academic institutions themselves could do an awful lot more and should do an awful lot more given the ratio of graduates to academic jobs at the end. So I think there's loads more, and I think you could think of lots of specific things. But for the moment, I think the onus still falls on the candidates themselves. And yeah, I think things like this are kind of the best way of empowering people. Just anything that exposes people to more people who've made the transition and more people who might be able to find roles for them and give them information. That's the best way.
Yeah, plus 100 to that. I think that definitely networking is a really great way to kind of just broaden what you know and what's out there. And oftentimes, everybody should make the choice that's right for them. And tech isn't for everybody, but it's hard to be what you don't see. And so, talking to more folks who have made that jump or who are interested in it is really great. And I think one thing that I wish I had done more of in my PhD was asking for help. And, this will be really helpful in tech as well, or in industry, to ask questions, to raise your hand if something's, if you're not getting something. But even in terms of like, hey, like I see you're connected to so-and-so, like I'd like to learn more about company X. Can you introduce us? Most people who have made this transition really want to help, but they, don't know how, they don't have Tori's organizing skills, but, give us a concrete ask and you will be surprised by how receptive people are.
Just to add to that briefly, I completely agree. You kind of need somebody who's already gone through that process to talk with you. And I would also say just open up candor, just ask them to be really, really candid with you about what's not working in your resume, your portfolio, what basic tasks can you do that maybe feel beneath you to get started. just ask for that kind of help, because that's the key to making the changeover. You need somebody who's got inside information, essentially. I do think there's probably something more institutions can do to make it more apparent how those things can transition, or your skills can transition over. I suspect there might be institutional reasons why there's not a desire to do that, as they want to have more professors and so forth in the ranks. But yeah, I found that pretty lacking from my experience as well, just exposure to those applications of those skills to industry. It seemed like a completely different world that didn't feel appropriate to me, frankly. But that's probably a longer, that's the next panel discussion around how to evolve grad school practice.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm aligning with a few other PhD career coaches to say, okay, if the universities aren't going to provide this, we're going to see what we can do to provide it elsewhere. So, and maybe we'll force the institutions to change by leading by example there. Anyways, so we are nearing time, and I want to be respectful of folks' time. So I think I'm going to wrap here. As we wrap up, let's be thankful for our panelists, and let's thank them for sharing their time and expertise. I know I learned a lot today, so thank you, thank you. I know folks are dropping thank yous into the chat. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to chat with folks. And let's also take a moment to forge future connections. So I'll drop my LinkedIn into the chat in case folks want to connect. Panel, I failed to double check with each of you whether I could drop your LinkedIn's into the chat, and so I will just let you do that if you'd like. Okay, and so thanks again to panelists, and for those in attendance, I hope you've seen today how you can leverage your doctoral training in tech. There are paths to get there. There are ways to leverage your network and ask for help. This is very much a journey that is possible if it's one that you want to make. I'm really grateful that our panelists were willing to share their journeys so that we can learn from their expertise. And I hope that each of you panelists and attendee find success in your careers, however you want to grow them. Taking what you want and actually putting it into practice, I find is the name of the game. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining today's discussion. Have a great rest of your Friday.
Thank you, Tori.
Bye, all.
Thanks, Tori. Thanks, all.